Good afternoon and welcome to another daily update from the Wildlife Trust at COP26. And today's COP theme is all about transport, because decarbonising our transport system is crucial to getting to net zero. Our emissions from transport have remained stubbornly high over the last 30 years. But having a greener transport system can also help us to get nature on the path to recovery. Our national infrastructure and transport system is crucial to being able to get nature into a better state, but also allow people to make greener choices about how they get around the place, walking and cycling more. So to do that, we've got Craig Bennett, who's going to be looking at issues around transport and national infrastructure. Rob Stoneman will be taking a deep dive into HS2, and I'll be speaking to Estelle Bailey, the Chief Executive of Berks and Oxon Wildlife Trust, onto some of the issues that are affecting her county. But first, a little update on what's been happening at COP over the last 24 hours. The key thing that happened this morning at COP was the publishing of the draft cover text for the negotiations. This is the kind of political wrapping paper for everything that's being talked around. And we've got the Prime Minister jetting back in to the give negotiations a bit of a boost, because what we've seen so far in the draft text is pretty unambitious. It doesn't live up to the scale of the emergency that we're seeing and really keep that crucial 1.5 degrees alive that was talked about in the Paris negotiations. And unfortunately, it kicks some of the decisions down the road when really we need to be making the big choices this decade. Because the big motivator yesterday was from the Climate Action Tracker. And what that looked at was, based on the pledges over the last few days at COP, how much the world might warm by the end of the century. We went into the negotiations at 2.7 degrees of warming, and we're still at 2.4 degrees of warming, they say. This will have disastrous consequences: high sea level rises, flooding and droughts, as well as more extreme weather events. So we need to get that number down even further with more ambitious pledges. The other big environmental news yesterday, domestically, didn't actually happen at COP. It happened a few hundred miles away down in London, where the Queen signed off the Environment Bill. It finally got its royal assent and will become the Environment Act. This has been a very long process. The bill's been in the Commons since it was a draft for over 1,000 days. And the Wildlife Trusts have been campaigning for new environmental legislation to put nature into recovery for over a decade now, and we finally achieved something. The bill isn't perfect, but it does some really important stuff for nature. It establishes a new Office for Environmental Protection, which is an environmental watchdog keeping public authorities to account on their environmental commitments and environmental law. And crucially, it creates local nature recovery strategies, which will help us create a nature recovery network across the country and better connect up our existing wildlife sites. And lastly, thanks to huge amounts of campaigning from Wildlife Trust members, over 200,000 people signed a petition for a State of Nature target, and we won it. In the bill is a legally binding target to halt the decline in the abundance of species by 2030. So hopefully by the end of the decade, we can get nature into recovery. But that's only 8 years away, so they need to get moving quick. So we're happy that the Environment Act has passed, but now it's the tough work in getting on with the job in delivering that. So that crucially means we need a planning system which helps us put nature into recovery and doesn't harm nature, as well as ensuring that the new Agriculture Act for payments for farmers to deliver public goods like environmental goods is really ambitious and helps the 70% of our land which is farmed get nature into recovery. It's a big day now this act has passed, but the hard work starts now.
So today's theme at COP26 is transport, and of course this is critically important because so many of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from the transport sector. And it's been a real disappointment, we have to say, that in the UK we've not really seen any change in that over the last few decades. Since 1990, emissions from road transport have flatlined in the UK. And in fact, emissions from aviation during that time have doubled. So it's ridiculous, really, that we've just not managed. It's the one sector of the UK economy where we've not seen any drop in emissions since the early 1990s. And of course, the government commits to make sure all the phase out of petrol and diesel cars by 2030 and shift to electric. That is good. But actually, the science is really clear on that. The Committee on Climate Change and others have said that actually just moving to electric vehicles is not enough to cut emissions. Actually, we've got to go a lot further and actually move cars off the road and move to what's called a modal shift. In other words, promoting walking and cycling and public transport if we're going to really see the cuts in emissions that are needed. Of course, also, there's the real problem with aviation emissions, and it was very disappointing that in the budget, just a week before COP26 started, Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, actually decreased air passenger duty, even on domestic flights in the UK, when there are those alternatives. That's sending all the wrong signals about how we've got to get out of fossil fuel powered transport into and find other alternatives like trains as well. But it's worth saying there, of course, obviously, when you're building new roads, they often go through wildlife sites, and that causes a problem. And right across the Wildlife Trust, we often find ourselves having to oppose road building schemes that will be bad for nature. But of course, there's HS2 as well. And my colleague Rob Stoneman is going to be talking about that shortly and the huge impact that has on wildlife. But a big thing to bear in mind in this, the problem that we really face on all of this is we don't have a national transport strategy. So how can you work out that HS2, for example, might decrease emissions, which is questionable anyway, but even if it was doing that, does that really mean anything if we're building new runways and new airports at the same time and increasing emissions from the aviation sector? We need a much more strategic overview and approach to transport in this country, and we need a clear overall long-term strategy, yes, to improve transport, but absolutely to get people out of their cars and onto bikes and walking and cycling and public transport instead. And then we can see a real cut in emissions from the UK transport sector.
Almost a decade ago now, the government announced the construction of HS2, a high-speed line running from London through to Birmingham and up to Manchester and another route up to Leeds. I mean, this could have been a fantastic sustainable transport project. What we actually have seen is really a disastrous scheme with huge amounts of environmental damage. Worse still, we've seen from HS2 Limited really a complete lack of regard for the natural environment and a lack of regard for the communities affected by HS2 on the route. For major infrastructure projects like HS2, we have to make sure that these projects actually enhance biodiversity rather than degrade and destroy wildlife, as HS2 is doing. The money's big. It's £100 billion now. In 2014, the Wildlife Trust produced a vision report which essentially looked at how we could create a ribbon of naturalistic green space running along the line. We costed that, at the time, less than 1% of the original budget. That was when it was 40 billion, so now only 0.5% of the budget. We can use national infrastructure to enhance our biodiversity if only we think it through properly. I'm going to hand over now to Estelle Bailey, who Elliot caught up with yesterday, and she's the Chief Executive of the Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust.
So what are the biggest risks posed by national infrastructure?
So national infrastructure projects are not subject to the same rules and regulations as ordinary developments, and therefore the risks to nature are far greater. So when we look at ordinary developments, and it's not quite mandatory yet, but there's something called biodiversity net gain, which requires the development to follow a certain hierarchy which leaves nature in a better state. And for national infrastructure projects, this currently isn't the case. So the risk to nature is absolutely huge. And we've seen that through HS2 locally here in Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire, and the devastation that has caused has been absolutely phenomenal. It really has. If we continue at this pace, there'll be nothing left. And the recent announcements from government about more road building and build, what kind of message does that send to us and the country when we're facing a climate emergency, a nature and climate emergency? And on the one hand, you've got a budget that is saying we want to build, and on the other hand, we've got COP26 where we're talking about trying to save our future, save the planet, and the two don't sit together. They just don't reconcile.
So we need a bit of a master plan to try and solve this, because there's huge amounts of pressures on our land, whether you need housing, you need space for nature, you need space to mitigate against climate change, you need space for roads and rails. That's a huge amount of pressure on a small amount of space, really. How can the government go about planning what needs to go where?
There will be a duty, and there is a duty for local nature recovery strategies to be produced. So if you look at that as a grand sort of master plan for the whole country, that would be the starting point. So we can identify where nature can recover at scale, and where people can live and where they can travel.
The government have said that they want to put nature on the path to recovery by 2030. Do you ultimately think that's possible without them re-looking at how we do national infrastructure?
Yeah, I think if we don't come away from COP with some sensible decisions, and if we don't put through an environment bill that places nature at the heart of decision making, then we will go nowhere. There will be absolutely no future on it. I'm no doubt about that. If we don't take this moment to stop and think about the future of nature, the future of humanity, the future of our economy, and how everything interlinks, this will be the biggest missed opportunity that we've lost.
Today's theme, of course, has all been about transport and how decarbonising our transport system is crucial to getting to net zero. But how, if we do it right, we can get nature in recovery as well. So what we need to do is get the government to help finance more sustainable modes of transport, instead of investing £29 billion in new road infrastructure. And that can help people make the right choices about taking public transport, walking or cycling. So at the Wildlife Trust, we'd really encourage you to get in touch with your MPs and councillors and lobby them to encourage the government to do more for sustainable transport. That's it from us. Tomorrow we'll be talking all about planning and looking at how the planning system can help us put nature into recovery. See you there.